Imagine settling into your airplane seat, ready for a peaceful flight, when suddenly, a man demands you move, just because he wants the seat for his child. That's exactly what happened to one black woman on a packed flight. She had booked and paid for her seat like everyone else, yet this father acted like her comfort didn't matter. He didn't ask politely. He didn't offer a reason beyond, "I need this seat." He just expected her to get up and move. At first, she was shocked. Why should she have to give up her spot? But as the tension built, other passengers started paying attention. Some looked uncomfortable, others just watched, waiting to see what she would do. And then, just when she thought she was alone in this, the flight attendant arrived. Now, you'd expect a flight attendant to take the side of a father traveling with a child, right? But what happened next left the entire plane stunned. Instead of pressuring the woman to move, the flight attendant did something no one saw coming. Was the father put in his place? Did the woman finally get the respect she deserved? And how did the rest of the flight react? Stay tuned, because this story takes a turn no one was expecting. The father's expression shifted from frustration to disbelief as the flight attendant calmly but firmly addressed him. "Sir, this passenger is in her assigned seat," she said. Her voice wasn't harsh, but it carried enough authority to make it clear she wasn't backing down. The woman, still sitting, tightened her grip on her armrest. She wasn't trying to cause a scene, but why should she have to defend herself for simply sitting in the seat she paid for? She glanced around, wondering if anyone would speak up. Some passengers avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice. A few whispered to each other, their expressions unreadable, but no one said a word. The father, still holding his child's hand, let out an impatient sigh. "Come on," he argued. "It's just a seat. Can't you be considerate? My daughter needs to sit with me." His tone was sharp, laced with entitlement, as if he expected her to just move without question. The woman hesitated. She wasn't heartless. She understood the importance of a child sitting with a parent. But why was it asterisk responsibility to fix this? Why hadn't the airline seated them together? Why hadn't he planned ahead? The flight attendant seemed to have the same thoughts. She turned to the man, her expression unreadable, and what she said next changed everything. The flight attendant let out a slow breath before speaking. "Sir, I understand you want to sit with your child, but this seat belongs to her," she said, nodding toward the woman. "If you need to switch seats, I can check if anyone else is willing to move." The father's jaw tightened. He glanced down at his daughter, then back at the woman still seated. "So, you're really just going to sit there and ignore the fact that my little girl has to sit alone?" His voice was louder now, drawing even more attention. The woman felt her stomach tighten. She hated being put in this position, being made to seem like the bad guy when all she did was sit in her assigned seat. She glanced at the little girl, who looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. It wasn't the child's fault. She deserved to sit with her dad. But was it fair to expect a stranger to fix the situation? A few rows back, a man in a business suit sighed and looked up from his laptop. A couple across the aisle exchanged glances. It was clear that people were uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. No one wanted to be involved. The flight attendant didn't waver. "Sir, did you ask the airline about seating together when you booked?" The father's face darkened. He didn't answer. Instead, he shook his head, muttering under his breath. The tension in the cabin thickened. Then, just as the silence stretched too long, someone else finally spoke up, and what they said took the argument in an entirely new direction. A voice cut through the tension. "Sir, why didn't you ask me instead?" Everyone turned toward the sound. A woman, a few rows ahead, leaned into the aisle. She looked at the father with an expression that was more curious than annoyed. "You're making a scene, but you never even asked if anyone else could switch." The father blinked, caught off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if realizing she had a point. The flight attendant raised an eyebrow, waiting for his response. The woman still seated felt a mix of relief and frustration. That's what I've been thinking this whole time. Asterisk. But instead of addressing the other passengers, the father doubled down. Why should I have to ask around when she's right here? He gestured toward the woman in the seat, his voice sharp. She could have just moved and saved us all this trouble. A murmur rippled through the cabin. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded, others frowned. The father's face turned red. His daughter, still clutching his hand, looked between the adults, her small brows furrowed in confusion. The flight attendant glanced toward the front of the plane, signaling to someone. Was she calling for backup? Would this escalate further? Just as the air seemed thick enough to cut with a knife, another voice, this time from the back of the plane, spoke up, and what they said sent a shockwave through the cabin. A deep voice from the back of the plane broke through the tension. Actually, that seat was supposed to be mine. Heads turned as a tall man in a grey hoodie stood up. His calm but firm tone carried over the murmurs, making everyone pause. The woman in the seat stiffened, confused. The father looked thrown off, his frustration momentarily replaced with surprise. The flight attendant immediately straightened. "Sir, what do you mean?" she asked, her professionalism never slipping. The man sighed and pulled out his boarding pass. "I was assigned that seat, but when I got to my row, someone else was sitting there. Rather than cause a scene, I just took an open spot a few rows back." He shot the father a knowing look. Funny how some people expect kindness, but don't show it themselves. The energy in the cabin shifted. People were no longer just passive observers, they were fully engaged. A few passengers exchanged hushed comments. Some shook their heads. The woman in the seat felt her pulse quicken. Asterisk so, she wasn't even supposed to be in this position. Asterisk, the father's entitlement, his demand, none of it should have even happened. The flight attendant exhaled slowly, clearly processing this new information. "Sir," she addressed the father, "did you switch seats without notifying the crew?" The father hesitated. His daughter squeezed his hand, sensing the change in his energy. Finally, he muttered, "There weren't any seats left together. I just made it work." A hush fell over the plane. The father had taken someone else's seat, but was demanding a stranger give up hers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The question now was, how would the flight attendant handle this? The cabin was silent, all eyes on the flight attendant. She took a measured breath before speaking. "Sir, you took someone else's seat without permission, and now you're asking another passenger to move for your convenience." Her voice was firm but calm. The father looked around, as if searching for sympathy, but the mood had shifted. The passengers weren't on his side anymore. The business traveler shook his head. The woman ahead, who had first called him out, crossed her arms. Even his own daughter, still clutching his hand, looked up at him with uncertainty. The flight attendant continued, "We cannot force another passenger to give up their seat because of a mistake that could have been avoided." She turned to the woman, her voice softer now. "You are not required to move. This is your assigned seat." The woman, still stunned by the revelation, gave a small nod. She wasn't going anywhere. Then, just when it seemed like the situation was over, another crew member approached. He handed the flight attendant a tablet and whispered something in her ear. She glanced at the screen, then back at the father. "Actually, sir, it looks like there's a last-minute seat change available for you and your daughter." The father perked up, relief washing over his face. "Finally," he muttered. The flight attendant didn't smile. "It's in the back row. No recline." The father's face fell. The back row, right next to the bathrooms. He hesitated for a long moment, then, realizing he had no choice, grabbed his carry-on and motioned for his daughter to follow. As he passed the woman in the seat, he avoided eye contact. She simply exhaled, shaking her head. As the father settled into his new spot, the tension in the cabin finally eased. The business traveler reopened his laptop. The woman ahead leaned back in her seat. The man in the grey hoodie smirked as he sat back down. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, the woman in the seat took a deep breath. She hadn't planned on being part of a showdown today, but one thing was clear: she wasn't the one who had been out of line. As the plane lifted off, the woman stared out the window, letting the tension of the last few minutes fade. She hadn't spoken much during the ordeal, but she didn't have to. The situation had spoken for itself. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. "I'm sorry," the little girl said, peeking over the seat in front of her. Her big eyes were filled with innocence, no trace of the frustration her father had shown. The woman gave her a small smile. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said gently. None of this had been the child's fault. She had simply been caught in the middle of something she couldn't control. The flight went on as if nothing had happened. The business traveler worked quietly, the woman who had spoken up earlier scrolled on her phone, and the man in the hoodie leaned back, satisfied with how things had turned out. As they prepared for landing, the woman couldn't help but reflect. This was never about just a seat. It was about entitlement, respect, and standing your ground, even when someone tries to make you feel like you don't belong. And as she stepped off the plane, she did so with her head held high, knowing she had every right to be there,